Hello and welcome. I'm Rawia Alami and this is the Dailies, where we take a look at important news stories, reports, analysis and articles published in newspapers and media outlets across the world. Today's front pages in the US were dominated by the tragic shooting in Minneapolis, with newspapers sharing both heartbreaking stories of the victims and profiles of the shooter. Across the country, coverage also continued on the fallout from President Trump's firing of Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, along with other recent dismissals of government officials. Over in the UK, the papers were closely dissecting Nigel Farage's controversial reform immigration plan, with a range of opinions stirring debate. Meanwhile, global conflicts, from the ongoing war in Ukraine to the crisis in Gaza, remain major stories commanding international attention. We'll start with the Washington Post, which reported today on the dramatic ousting of CDC Director Susan Monares just weeks after her confirmation. The report details how Monares clashed with Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. over vaccine policy, resisting demands to scale back approvals and dismiss senior staff. Her removal sparked the resignation of top CDC officials, highlighting turmoil at the nation's premier health agency. The piece also underscores the broader political backdrop, Kennedy's long-standing skepticism of vaccines and his sweeping restructuring of federal health policy. With Monares disputing the legality of her dismissal, the report illustrates a deepening institutional crisis in public health governance, raising urgent questions about science, politics, and the credibility of America's pandemic response. Another dismissal of an American government official was exclusively reported by the Wall Street Journal today, as President Trump fires Robert Primus, a Democratic member of the Surface Transportation Board, the regulator currently weighing a high-stakes rail merger between Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern. Now, the move was framed as the latest episode in the president's attempt to assert control over independent agencies. However, the newspaper also published an interesting analysis as to why the American public or even financial markets might not be very concerned with such firings. In another report, the Journal examines why financial markets barely reacted to President Trump's firing of Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, despite the move being one of the sharpest challenges yet to Fed independence. The piece argues that investors had already priced in Trump's hostility towards the central bank, making the dismissal less shocking. It also outlines 5 reasons markets remain calm. Cook's resistance may trigger institutional pushback. Jerome Powell remains central, and Trump's appointees are not seen as reckless, and the Fed was already signaling a softer stance on rates. Still, of course, the report warns that investors might be too relaxed. If they don't push back when Trump goes too far, the usual checks on him could disappear, making it more likely that politics will interfere with the Fed in ways that could hurt the economy, or could indeed hurt the economy for a long time. Kate Shaw wrote in the New York Times, tackling President Trump's unprecedented attempt to remove Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, raising urgent questions about the limits of presidential power. Drawing on legal analysis from Columbia law professors, Shaw highlights the Fed's deliberately insulated structure designed to safeguard monetary policy from political interference. The piece underscores how the Supreme Court's recent Wilcox ruling weakened agency independence, emboldening Trump's move, and Shaw frames Cook's case not just as a defense of central bank autonomy, but also as a stress test for constitutional checks and balances, warning that unchecked executive authority could indeed spill into judicial independence. The article concludes with a call for the court to reassert boundaries before presidential power eclipses institutional safeguards. British newspapers continue to analyse Nigel Farage's reform immigration plan, with many opinion articles tackling the issue. Juliet Samuel, for one, wrote in The Times arguing that Britain's approach to migration has become stuck in endless legal fights and political debates. Using the failed Rwanda deportation plan as an example, she shows how ideas once dismissed as extreme, like tough deportation measures, often come back when the system is overwhelmed. The article points out that other countries, including Germany, the US, and also Australia, have successfully used similar policies to reduce illegal immigration. Samuel warns that Britain may soon adopt measures similar to Nigel Farage's proposals, even if politicians and critics once mocked them. The piece highlights how public pressure and practical challenges often push governments to act on ideas they once rejected. A different opinion was delivered by Rawia Alami in The Guardian, reflecting the controversial nature of the Farage's reform plan. Bahar argues that Nigel Farage is using the migration issue to gain political influence, pushing bold and extreme plans for deporting migrants. Farage's proposals, including cash incentives for voluntary departures and detention for others, ignore international law and human rights protections. The author points out that these ideas, while extreme, gain attention because mainstream politicians, including Labour's Keir Starmer, avoid directly confronting them or linking them to the problems caused by Brexit. The article warns that this silence allows Farage to dominate the debate and shape public opinion. Bahar calls for clear, honest political leadership to expose Farage's record and prevent his ideas from setting the agenda. To the war on Gaza, as the Telegraph reported today on the meeting at the White House between former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair and US President Donald Trump, focusing on the plans to rebuild Gaza. According to the report, Blair, acting as an advisor to Trump Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, contributed ideas for stabilizing the region and delivering humanitarian aid with support from international and Arab partners. The talks come after a deadly Israeli strike on a Gaza hospital that killed 20 people, including journalists and medical staff. The piece points out that details of the proposals remain undisclosed, but the discussions also included expanding aid distribution and potential post-war reconstruction. Jared Kushner was present as well at the meeting, and Blair drew on his experience as a former Middle East envoy to advise on conflict resolution strategies. Sam Minassa wrote in Sharq al-Awsat analyzing statements made by Tom Barak, the U.S. envoy to Syria and Lebanon, regarding Hezbollah and Lebanon's political landscape. Minassa contends that Barak's remarks signal a potentially significant shift in U.S. policy, portraying Hezbollah as a necessary partner in Lebanon and suggesting that concessions might be offered to the group in exchange for cooperation. The author argues that this approach risks strengthening Hezbollah's influence over Lebanon's Shiite community and undermining efforts to centralize arms under state control. The piece highlights concerns that Washington's policy lacks clarity, may sideline non-Hezbollah voices within Lebanon, and could have long-term consequences for the country's institutions, security, and social cohesion. The article concludes that Barak's statements represent both strategic ambiguity and a potential recalibration of U.S. priorities in the region. And we'll end with The Economist, which published a report challenging a long-standing assumption about happiness across age groups. Traditionally, surveys showed middle age as life's low point, with younger and older people generally more satisfied. But according to the report, new findings published in PLOS ONE suggest that the curve has shifted dramatically. Young people worldwide now report the highest levels of unhappiness. Also, drawing from the US, the UK, and 44 other countries, the study reveals that Gen Z, or Gen Z, begins adulthood more miserable than any prior generation, as you can see in this graph. And explanations that range from precarious work to declining job satisfaction to the rise of social media as well, though no single cause fully accounts for the trend. The piece warns that if today's youth start this slow, midlife may become even more difficult for them in the future. That's it for today. Thanks for watching.